All right. Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to today's call, our last virtual Chairman's Advisory Board event of 2022. We're grateful to have you with us. I'm Matt Hunter, Vice President for Strategic Partnerships at Hudson Institute. I want to thank all of you for your flexibility on timing this morning, and I also want to thank Senator Rubio for still making time to join us. This is a really busy time in the Senate. Lots of votes this time of year. There's a special election coming up in a couple of days that will have some pretty significant impacts for the senator and his colleagues. So I think it's a sign of Senator Rubio's good character and how much he appreciates Hudson, that he's still making time to be with us. We'll get right into the conversation so we can make the most of the time we have. I would just before we begin, remind all of you that we still have a few places available left at Hudson's Gala on December 11th, where we'll be joined by another close friend in the U.S. Senate, Tom Cotton, and I hope you'll remember Hudson during your end of year philanthropic plans, whether it's the Gala or Mike Duran's work on the Middle East, Peter Rao and Luke Coffey on Europe and Ukraine, H.R. McMaster on Japan, and of course all that Walter does, and most recently our addition of Bill Barr, who's doing critical work on law and order and crime in our country. Our guests today really need no introduction. Senator Marco Rubio is the senior senator from the state of Florida. It's hard to believe that he is now in his third term, or about to be in his third term. He is the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, also on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I would also say many of you who know Senator Rubio, if you've ever heard his story, tell his story of his family, his parents coming to the United States from Cuba in search of a better future, growing up in Florida. And in Las Vegas, and how the son of a bartender and a maid at a hotel could become a U.S. senator is one of the most powerful defenses of the American dream, at least I've ever heard. So we're grateful to have people like Senator Rubio in the Congress. Walter Russell Mead, of course, is our Ravenel B. Curry Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship. He is the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and interestingly enough, he just returned from a trip to Taiwan and Japan, which I think may come up in the discussion today. I'm going to just offer the reminder, as always, we are off the record, and I'm going to let Walter take it over from here.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. And thanks to all the Hudson folk and friends who are joining us on the Chairman's Advisory Committee. Hope you guys are all enjoying the end of the year. And I'd second what Matt says about please remember Hudson in your planning. And I hope I'll see a bunch of you at the gala. Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And personally, I always enjoy a chance to see you, one of the senators who really does think about foreign policy and foreign affairs. So I got some questions. You may have some, if you've got some other thoughts you want to bring up, please feel free. We're interested in you, not me this morning. I mean, I'm interested in me, but that's a different thing. There are big protests right now going on in both Iran and China. What do you think of these protests, and where do you think they're headed, and what should the United States be doing? Is the Biden administration doing enough?
Well, a couple of things that I think they remind us of, and that is, first of all, thanks for having me this morning and the chance to answer some of the questions regarding these important topics. I don't think we spend nearly enough time talking about them and informing people about them in the right way, because these aren't simple issues. I think Iran and China have different catalysts behind it, but both are there are two things they have in common. These are people that live in repressive societies where the ability to express yourself and to redress grievances with those in power are very, very limited. That's certainly the case in China, where the Communist Party places itself above all else in terms of the country. Its grip on power is its number one priority before anything else. And in the case of Iran, where we have a real disconnect between a country where the power resides in the hands of a clerical regime and with a facade of being a republic of elected officials, but with a board of supervisors that are a bunch of religious clerics, and a population that frankly doesn't reflect those clerical views. This is people in Iran that are part of an ancient, long-time Persian culture that was rich in the arts, rich in tradition, rich in all sorts of in fact, Iran was frankly a very cosmopolitan place up until 1979. And in many ways, its populace still retains many of those concepts. So I don't know of any place on earth where the people who have the power and the people of a country are more different than they are in a place like Iran. So that's the basic subset. The catalysts behind them are different. In the case of Iran, obviously there are a lot of individual grievances from real economic suffering and challenges that people are facing on a daily basis, to the fact that women there want certain rights that are not being recognized. And there is no way for people who are upset about the economy or who are upset about how women are treated, there is no way for them to get that to change without protest. It's their only outlet they have at this point. So what's interesting to me about Iran is, and I'm not arguing that we're there yet, but there are a lot of interesting similarities between the conditions in Iran today under the Ayatollah and some of the basic ingredients that were present in Iran in the late 70s under the Shah. A lot of the same sort of elements, both societal and governmentally, are in place. Where the Shah invested very heavily in conventional capabilities to position himself as the regional power militarily, did so at the expense of both, and I'm not in favor of it, but at both at the ability of his forces to repress, but also some of the more basic needs the country had at that time. And the same is true in Iran now, where they've spent the bulk of their national treasure on being able to project power in the region through its support of terrorism and proxies, but left unmet some very basic societal needs at home. So there's a lot of elements that are very similar that I think they're watching. In the case of China, I think, frankly, it's a country that's going on its third year of COVID zero policies, where they are literally locking people in homes and barricading streets. And all human beings are going to resist that. Everywhere in the world where these policies have been instituted, people have fought back and pushed back against them. Everywhere. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, you name me a place, Europe, and people push back on it. The difference, obviously, is that China has the repressive capability to crack down on this, and they have created a system. They have a system in place. So I think it would be a mistake for us to think that, I think that people are there basically seeking the overthrow of the government, and I think it's absurd for the Chinese. Not that they're in favor of everything the government does, but I think that's an exaggeration. That I think it's reached that point. I think what you have in China is very simple. You have people that don't want to be locked up in their homes, want to be able to go to school, and want to be able to go to work, and a regime that isn't going to tolerate them speaking out and is going to crack down on it. And sometimes these things have this discontent has ability of escalating, and the Chinese worry a lot about it. They've long worried about it. It's a big country with a lot of people and a lot of different ethnic areas as well that they're concerned about, and they spend a lot of time, money, and thought and energy on how could they quell discontent in society forcefully if necessary.
Yeah. Just to switch geographical focus for a minute, what do you think is the appetite on the Hill for more aid to Ukraine? I'm seeing we've spent something like $68 billion since the war began. Do you think the new Congress is going to be more willing, less willing to spend, or is it going to come out about the same?
Well, Ukraine is also a complicated situation. So one of the things that I observe about Ukraine is that neither side in this battle can achieve victory as they have defined it. In the case of Ukraine, at least publicly, their definition of victory is to drive the Russians out past their border back into Russia and recapture everything, including Crimea. They militarily do not have the capability to do that. The Russian definition of victory is to gain control over, if it's no longer Kyiv, at least a substantial part of the eastern part of that country, and holding on to Crimea. And they don't have the military capability to do that. You've seen them already retrench to what they feel are more defensible lines right now. But even there, they're going to struggle with it. both the flaws in their military and the depletion of both fighting forces and material that the Russians have experienced have been quite substantial. I mean, the Russians at this point, at least conventionally, are in no position to invade any country, not to mention expand their hold on Ukraine. So the Russians, I think Putin's counting on is, at some point, the support of the West to Ukraine will begin to wane. The suffering of the people of Ukraine will continue to grow as they continue to inflict damage in the winter to their electric grid. And it will change the battlefield. It will change the leverage dynamics in favor of in favor of the Russian. What I think Putin ultimately will be able to defend to himself and to those whose loyalty he needs is if he can at least hold on, not just to Crimea, but all of the Donbass region, and basically solidify that as outside the realm of Ukrainian sovereignty. I think he won't state that publicly, but I think that's their long-term goal. I think for Ukraine, the real long-term goal is probably to drive the Russians back to the pre-February lines. And so in some ways, they're similar to one another, but what's happening now is both sides continue to try to make gains necessary to strengthen their hand in an eventual negotiation. So there comes your question about funding. On the one hand, signaling that our support for Ukraine could somehow waver would in many ways strengthen Putin's approach to this. It's one of the things he's counting on, because if we do it, the Europeans most certainly will do it, since they already face critical shortages of some of the material they need, and their own publics are starting to speak out against it. The flip side of it is that we live in a republic, and in Europe, these are all democracies, and the people of those countries are saying to themselves, we have a lot of problems here at home that we need to deal with. We can't continue to write $60 billion checks every 6 months. We're on their side, we wish them the best, but we can't continue to do it. And so your question about the appetite, I think there's still strong support for Ukraine. I think the question is, but I think it would be a mistake to conclude that we can continue to get the votes necessary for 30, 40, $50 billion of aid every 4 to 5 months or 6 months. I think it would be a mistake to conclude that that's an automatic. I think every time they go to the well on that, it's going to get harder and harder and harder to get those votes. And we may see the first sort of indication of that in the new Congress, where new members who were just elected are coming in, and I'm sure they've heard it from their constituents a lot about why are we spending all this money on someone else's war.
Yeah. To get it back to Iran for a minute, the nuclear enrichment program continues. In some ways, it accelerates. Iran is getting closer to Russia. Do we have an Iran policy? And what can the U.S. do to counter Iran's nuclear program and its other threatening activities? We're reading about new Iranian-sponsored terrorism and assassination attempts here in the U.S. What do we need to be doing?
Well, I think the mistake the administration's making, in my view, is trying to resurrect a nuclear deal that, even if it was a bad idea in my view when it was first constructed, but today it's obsolete. The world looks very different than it did when that deal was first struck, and Iran is behaving very differently. Since that time, the Iranian officials, we now know, have been caught actively trying to hire people to assassinate former government leaders in the homeland of the United States. That in and of itself should be the end of the negotiation. Since that time, Iran has openly violated UN resolutions on sharing missiles and drones and the sale of these UAVs to the Russians, and in the exporting of rocket systems, which they continue to do. So they're already in violation of that. The Iranians have continued to increase their enrichment capability, and they're doing it because they think it's ratcheting up pressure on the West to cut a deal with them. The timeline they really face is that at some point, if they are in violation of these, for example, because of the UAVs, they're in violation of these UN mandates, there's going to be automatic snapback sanctions put in place that the Europeans will have to be a part of as well. And so they're on the clock in regards to that. And then they have a domestic group inside the country who basically don't want there to be a deal. I always walk away from the notion of moderates, and it's not the way I just define politics in Iran, but you do have a group in Iran, including the president, who's elected, and that's the person people blame when the economy is doing poorly. And so that group desperately wants sanctions relief because they just want some economic improvement so that they'll be reelected. Because even though they don't have the same power that our presidents have, they want to be reelected. The flip side of it is you've got individuals within the Majil there, the legislative body, that have pushed laws that are binding on what these negotiators can give in on, because they basically don't think there should be a deal. These are groups that basically do want Iran to retain the right to a nuclear capability. I think from Iran's perspective, ultimately, the ultimate decision maker about whether they're going to develop a weapon is the clerical leader, the Ayatollah, and his successor. My view of it, my prediction, my analysis is that Iran will eventually conclude that at a minimum, they want to be a nuclear capable power. They may not initially test a weapon, but I think they've already proven they can enrich. They've already proven they have the missiles that could potentially deliver a nuclear device in the region. And all they're missing is a design. But if you have those elements in place, you are in essence a nuclear power. Whether you have them in your stockpile or not, you can very quickly become one. And so my view of it is Iran is already at that threshold. And our question now needs to be, what can we do to mitigate against the risk that it poses? What can we do to create a deterrent against them using these systems in a conflict? And what can we do to act to inflict pain and punishment on them for their continued sponsorship of terrorism around the region? And it's not, we make a mistake when we think that when we deal with Iran, we are dealing with some Western power or some traditional country. We're not. We're dealing with a clerical regime whose view of government is very different than what we define as our view of government. I'm not talking about the people of Iran. I'm talking about the government. It is a government that's organized around clerical principles, and that is the obligation I mean, they basically view the Ayatollah not just as the supreme leader of the country, but the supreme leader of all Shia Muslims in the world, and with an obligation to be the world power in that regard. And part of that equation, in my view, will ultimately be having a nuclear weapon or a nuclear capability that holds them immune from foreign action against them. They say Gaddafi's dead because he didn't have a weapon. Saddam Hussein was executed because he didn't have a weapon. And the best way to make sure no one can come after you is to have what Kim Jong-un has in North Korea, and that's a weapon. Kim Jong-un didn't have a nuclear weapon, they would have taken him out a long time ago. We're not going to let that ever happen to us. So in the short term, they've done it by developing conventional capabilities and the threat of developing a nuclear capability. But it is my view they're already at that threshold. And now we need to invest in things like missile defense and inflicting pain on them for their sponsorship of terrorism through proxies in the region and around the world.
I've just come back from Japan, and the constant refrain I heard there is that the United States is missing in action when it comes to the economic competition with China. What does the United States need to do to compete economically with China in Asia? And is the trade agenda really dead in Congress?
Well, I think it's a mistake to view simply trade as the only vehicle, trade agreements as the only vehicle by which we can compete. I would start domestically and work outwards. To the extent that we're missing in action, as they say, I think what we're missing is a strategic view, because we're still in the midst of transitioning away from a post-Cold War belief that once a country became rich and prosperous, they would become democracies and they would follow the rules and that they would become like us. And I think China has proven that it is possible to become more prosperous and economically without adhering to the rules. They most certainly will avail themselves of all of the benefits of the rules-based system, but always want to skirt or ignore the responsibilities of that system. So I think for us as a country, it begins by the recognition of simply having more American companies doing business in China is not only not going to change China, it actually will allow China to eventually own companies just like those and even more efficient and kick those companies out. So we're still going through that here. I think in the realm of that, part of the challenges we have is when you go to countries anywhere in the world and you say to them, you shouldn't be doing this with the Chinese or buying that from the Chinese, they'll say, well, what's the alternative? There is no alternative available. What's the alternative to Huawei that's affordable? What's the alternative to them on new energy? What's the alternative to them on investment, like the Belt and Road Initiative has provided? What's the alternative to the Chinese? In many cases, and they do have some unfair advantages when they go out and market this stuff. They can bribe officials, they can invest in projects that are not cost efficient for purposes of geopolitical reach. We, on the other hand, largely rely on the private sector to do it. And the private sector in America is not going to develop something that you can't make money on, and they're not going to invest in projects that don't make a profit. So I think we have to reorder our thinking in that regard and ask ourselves whether economic presence and economic development assistance is a tool of foreign policy or a tool of economic growth for us and benefit. And that, I think, is the real challenge that we still haven't grappled with as far as a strategic view of what it means both in Asia and beyond. And I think we also have to reorder our thinking in the sense that I think it's a mistake to go to countries in Europe, in Japan, in Asia, but anywhere in the world and say, you're either with them or you're with us. Many of these countries do not want to be forced to pick a side. They want to work with us the Indians want to work with us on some things with China, but there are other things when it comes to Russia that they're less open to because they have historic ties to them. The same is true for the Koreans. I mean, the South Koreans, they clearly are not fans of the Chinese, but they also want to calibrate what they do because the Chinese can inflict immediate pain on their economy. And they do need the Chinese at some point as a leverage against what Kim Jong-un might be willing to do. So each of these Australia, Japan, I think they can afford to be a little bit more aggressive and are willing to be within the context of what is in their capabilities. So I think we have to approach each of these countries with a different view of it. And I don't think we can do it's us versus them. And many of we're smart about it. We have to be strategic about how we construct these bilateral relationships.
To shift geographical focus yet again, and by the way, for those listening into the call, Senator Rubio, I think, is one of the few senators who's kind of willing to do the sort of tour d'horizon approach to world politics and comment on a big range of issues that cover many dimensions, but many geographies. When I look at the news that's coming out of Mexico and most of the rest of Latin America these days, I find it not at all encouraging, and a sort of an accumulation of policies, of movements, and of developments that are, I think, may pose real long-term threats. From your perspective, and I know you're someone who pays attention to Latin America, how would you evaluate the situation to our south, and what do you think? Where do you think American foreign policy ought to be focused?
Well, in Latin America, in particular, the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah. In Latin America.
So there's a couple things I would say about the region. The first is I think we have to prepare ourselves for this new dynamic. We are heading rapidly, if we're not already there, you're already beginning to see the outlines of it, to a world that basically is broken up into three blocks. The first block is sort of the democracies, the traditional allies of America and the free world, and then sort of a China, Russia, Iran block, as I call the axis of the sanctioned, countries that, as they face these sanctions, look for ways to create alternative mechanisms to avoid it. And obviously the big player there being China, and then obviously Iran and Russia with lesser capabilities, but nonetheless can pose real risks. And then these developing countries all over the world who are going to look at this and say, I'm going to leverage these guys against each other to cut the best deal I can. So I'm going to buy weapons from America by threatening to buy them from China, but I'm going to accept, Chinese loans to build ports and Chinese economic activity because America and the West have no alternative that makes sense. And I think that many of the countries that are making those decisions are in the Western Hemisphere. These are developing countries that need the kind of money and the commerce that China can offer and provide, despite the long-term risks it poses to their own sovereignty. But they also don't want to break with America because all their weapon systems are American weapon systems, so they need the maintenance of them. And because they prefer, to have us on their side when it comes to the security guarantees, because they can't afford to provide them for themselves. So that's a balancing act that's playing out in multiple places. So in Colombia, we will remain their primary defense partner. That's their preference. But I think you're going to see in the new administration there much more willingness to work and do things with the Russians or the Chinese that they haven't done in the past. And I think that's going to replicate. Now, clearly, you've seen the rise of left-wing populist leaders in multiple countries. I think it's a mistake to conclude it's because the region has gone left. Right? There's certainly their left and right is different than ours. So Venezuela is a great example. There really has never been a tradition of conservatism as we define it in American politics. I think all of the parties and elements involved in Venezuelan politics have been center left from our definition of center left. Some reaching all the way to Marxism, to somewhere what we would define as some more socialist democratic models, but nonetheless, that's been their tradition. So these countries generally tend in that direction to begin with. But what I think you have seen in election after election is a rejection of an anti-incumbent rejection of the status quo. They had COVID too. If we felt the impact economically, they felt it even more. If we think we're feeling the impact of energy, they're feeling it just as much, if not more so. And so I think it's been a rejection of whoever was in power. And in the cases of Brazil and Chile and Colombia and other places, and previous to that, Argentina, it was leaders that were more aligned with the US openly in many cases. And also you have more free market views of how economics played out. In that context, I would tell you that America, and I think this is true for both parties, but especially true of this administration and typically Democratic administrations, we have a tendency to try to accommodate and create better relations with our adversaries or enemies, or those who aren't doing what we want them to do, and a tendency to be really tough on our allies and our friends, either tough on them or ignore them. So you see that playing out in Guatemala, where we have a pro-American president that we're browbeating because of his social agenda is more conservative because it reflects the country. Or in Ecuador, where we have probably the most pro-American president in Ecuador's history. We should be bending over backwards to make the guy a success story so that he can go back and prove that being a friend of America is good for Ecuador, and instead is being largely ignored. On the flip side of it is, I anticipate we're going to spend a lot of time trying to make nice with Maduro, and previous to that, and maybe Brazil now as well. And so people pick up on these cues, and they argue that the best way to get what you want out of America is to threaten to do something with the Russians, the Chinese, or the Iranians. So I think that's really the challenge in the region, is we haven't figured out that dynamic. And if I were to say what we need to do, we need to care, number one. And number two is we have to have a strategy in place in which those leaders who cooperate and partner with America have tangible benefits to that partnership that they can turn to their population and say, look, this is what I was able to deliver. When they have a strategy to deliver on that, and there has to be consequences for those that are not. And right now we just haven't had that in any sustained, incredible way. Obviously, there's some anomalies and all, not anomalies, but there's a third bucket of countries in the region which are just straight up authoritarian. Venezuela is a complete and utter disaster. Nicaragua is a complete and utter disaster. You just don't hear a lot about it because they don't have a lot of natural resources. Cuba is facing the worst economic crisis in its history because of incompetence and because Marxism simply doesn't work. They can blame sanctions all they want, but that's not accurate. They can trade with any country in the world. They just can't. They have an economic meltdown there. And then, of course, Haiti, which is a societal collapse. And if I go into the new year sort of really concerned about a out of control mass migration, a rapid mass migration crisis out of Haiti and or Cuba. We've already had more people leave Cuba in the last year than all of Mariel, than all of the rafter crisis, doubled. Over 2% of the population of Cuba has left or tried to leave in the last 2.5 years. That's an extraordinary figure.
Yeah. Are they coming to Florida or going through the southern border? What's happening?
Yeah, the vast majority of both Haitians and Cubans are coming overland. So they're traveling to some Latin America country. For Nicaragua accepts them without visa requirement. You can fly to Nicaragua and then you join the same trafficking networks that bring you right to the US border. Many Venezuelans have made the same journey from Colombia, Brazil, wherever they've been coming from, and they come all the way down. And a lot of the Haitians too. For example, there was a substantial number of Haitians in Chile. When Chile was going through a construction boom and needed labor, they encouraged Haitians to come visa-free. Well, now the boom is over and Haitians are stuck in Chile and don't want to go back to Haiti and maybe have family members in America. But we are seeing an increased number of people coming overseas. So there's not a day that goes by now that the Coast Guard isn't intercepting a raft of Cubans or Haitians, and some to real tragic outcomes as well. We don't really know how many people have died on the way over, but there's no doubt it's in the hundreds just in the last year.
We hear a lot of discussion, maybe mostly in the media, about the trade-offs between aiding Ukraine and dealing with China. You know, that how much of our weapons, how much of our money, how much of our attention and focus is going to go to one or the other. Do you think that's the right way to frame this conversation? And where do you come out in all of this?
Well, I would say it's related to that conversation in two ways. The first is, I would not diminish. I don't think we should ignore the fact that the Chinese are watching very carefully how Ukraine plays out and have watched it from the beginning, because they see an analog in Taiwan and they wanted. So for example, they have watched how the world has reacted to Russia and how they've sanctioned Russia, and have begun to take steps to insulate their own economy from similar sanctions, and even when they move on Taiwan. The same is true. They're looking for how long can the West sustain its pro-Ukrainian approach. So they're watching very carefully to see, well, you know, if the Europeans, for example, were only willing to stick around for a year to take on Putin in their own continent, what would they? How long would they stick around or even care about Taiwan? Same with the Americans. You know, I mean, yes, the Americans can say whatever they want, but ultimately, is their population really willing to go to war and suffer economically for a small island off the coast of China, off the coast? And so I think it's related to that. Secondary to it is, but important, is do not underestimate the damage this has done to the Russian military capability. It has depleted their stockpiles of everything. It has exposed weaknesses in their conventional fighting forces. And by the way, that comes with some level of danger, because this is a country that has tactical nuclear weapons in its stockpile and has threatened to use them to avoid humiliating defeat. But I would say that today, as I said earlier, Russia is in no shape to pose any sort of conventional threat to Western Europe. And that the notion of them invading anybody in Europe at this point is now or for the foreseeable future is far-fetched. I do think that what it does, even as we continue to help Ukraine, is that I think it gives us the opportunity to now say we're going to continue to be supportive of NATO. But in terms of personnel and spending, we're going to focus building up our Asia Pacific presence as a deterrent to things happening in that part of the world, where between North Korea and China's threat on Taiwan, you have a much more systemic long-term risk. So it's not about abandoning NATO, it's about reorienting our priorities. But I think it's important to understand that they are interrelated in the way of how China's perceiving it, the lessons they're picking up from it, and also in the impact it's had on Russia's conventional capabilities, which will probably take a decade to rebuild.
I think that's a good point, that Russia's defeats in Ukraine and the attrition really is changing the balance. I sometimes worry that Germany's change of heart, the Zeitenwende, as they call it, may not survive a German sense that Russia's actually gotten a lot weaker and they may be able to kind of go back to sleep. So it could be an interesting time over there. Maybe one final question from me, and then we can go to some of our Hudson friends who are here, and Matt can handle that. We hear a lot about inflation. Many of us, I just got a 10% maintenance increase in my apartment. So I'm not just hearing about inflation, I'm experiencing it. When it comes to the military budget, inflation is really a problem. And if you look at where we might be headed without some big changes in the numbers, we would be headed for very substantial cuts over the next 3 or 4 years in the purchasing power of our military. How do you look at that, and where do you think the budget needs to go? And I know there's been talk on Capitol Hill about another $45 billion or so added for this year. Where are we on defense budget, and what needs to happen?
Well, I think it's something that is going to have to be addressed. I don't have exactly the right number yet for you as to what it should be arrived at to sort of meet the demands. But I think it really all begins with strategy. You need the strategic before you can reach the tactical. So what is our military strategy? What is it that we view for the next 50 years the United States defense needs are going to be? And then we prioritize on the basis of that. And I think we're heading counterterrorism is still a threat. but we're not going to be invading any countries in the Middle East anytime in the foreseeable future. Our commitment to NATO remains very strong, but the conventional threat that Russia poses to Western Europe has been substantially, at least from their capabilities, diminished because of the war in Ukraine. I think that we view like what are the flashpoints that could really test America over the next 50 years? They're almost all in the Indo-Pacific region. And so it's an understanding of what it would take to prevent that from happening. And the best way to prevent something like that from happening is to leave no doubt in the minds of the Chinese that the costs of any sort of military adventurism in the region outweigh the benefits. And that's a tough calculus because their pain point is Xi is so personally invested in what he calls reunification with Taiwan. It's such a key part of his personal legacy that I fear the price they're willing to pay is substantially high. I also think what's very dangerous here is that they view America as a stagnant, rapidly declining power. And so you sometimes begin to worry that they underestimate our capabilities and establish a risk calculus that's not aligned with reality in terms of what our real capabilities are. Now, you talk about the impact of inflation. There's no doubt that there's an impact that just puts even more pressure on ensuring that we're prioritizing where we put the money. I think we have some other factors in place to consider, and that is, in addition to the need to sustain legacy programs, we have the need to continue to improve, the technology and how we integrate that into warfighting. I mean, the Chinese are moving very rapidly to being the first fighting force in the history of the world that integrates big data, quantum, artificial intelligence, that integrates all of this into a sustained warfighting effort in ways that threatens to surpass us if all we do is fund legacy programs without funding the sort of research and development necessary to develop this. In essence, it's almost like a 21st century version of the Maginot Line. We're investing a lot in building up defenses towards a war that's never going to be fought because we didn't realize that the opposition has figured out a way to get tanks through a forest. So I worry about that. And then we have a real recruitment challenge. Just like we're facing labor pressures in the economy, we're facing labor pressures. It's harder than ever to recruit people to serve. We're admitting a larger and larger percentage of those with waivers, meaning with conditions or strikes against them that normally would disqualify them from service. It's now impacting that as well. And I think part of it is, inflation impacts them too. The ability to retain people in service, to basically re-up contracts for the enlisted, is getting harder because it costs more for them to pay for housing. It's just not as affordable. So these are all challenges that have to be taken into account. But to me, it begins with a strategic vision of what our defense needs are going to be, and then prioritizing your spending. There's no doubt we're going to need to spend more money over a sustained and predictable period of time. That's why it's important to have real appropriations bills, because it allows you to programmatically spend. But we also have to make sure that we are spending it on the right things, because today still too much of our military Pentagon budget is spent on legacy programs that have constituencies built around them, but that frankly are not part of our long-term strategic view in some cases.
Great. Well, thank you. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, but Senator, this was a great conversation, and I hope we can follow up soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And Senator, we've got, I know you have a hard stop, but we've got two good questions that came in via email. I'm hoping that maybe you can answer before you have to run. The first is related to the topic we were just discussing. In the last year, two senior Pacific commanders have given altering timelines on the potential for a Chinese move on Taiwan. One suggested that it was 5 years. Another said that it could come as soon as this year. And then 2 weeks ago in Bali, President Biden said he did not see any type of action like that on the horizon. From your perch on the Intelligence Committee, as much as you can describe, what's your view on what the window is for potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to say any of those three things. And I understand they have different incentives for doing that. I think in the case of Biden, if you recall, this was either right before or right after his meeting with Xi. And so there's this effort to sort of warm relations a little bit with him. And so accusing them of imminently invading Taiwan would probably undermine that. In the case of a military leader who believes that we need to be investing more in that region and in certain things, the sense of urgency. I'm not saying they're lying. I'm saying the sense of urgency serves a purpose. Here's what I would say. I do not believe that this decade will end, that we will reach 2030 without something happening with regards to Taiwan. Now, that something ranges from a full invasion of beginning with some of these disputed islands and working inwards, all the way to a Taiwanese surrender. Basically, Taiwan concluding that they would lose a war, that America, even if they wanted to, would not be able to come to their defense in time, and therefore we might as well cut a deal. I think that's the preference of the Chinese. Beijing's preference is that Taiwan realizes, look, the American people are not going to support sending and they're not going to lose sending their boys and girls off to die on behalf of Taiwan, and they're not going to lose 2 aircraft carriers to our new anti-ship missiles for Taiwan. So no matter what they tell you, they're not going to do it. So you're on your own, and on your own means you're going to lose. So therefore, you might as well cut the best deal you can with us right now. I think that's the Chinese preference. But I would not underestimate what a big deal this is to them. To them, this is not about land or about territory. It is about the broader vision of a unified China as emerging as a great power, and the notion of America. I mean, think about what that would mean. If in fact, Taiwan is forced into the Chinese orbit, what that would mean is that it would be the equivalent of the handover of Hong Kong, signaling sort of the end of British influence in that region in a somewhat humiliating way. What that would mean is that we've entered a new era in human history where America is no longer the world's most powerful country. China wanted Taiwan, China got Taiwan, America couldn't do anything about it and had to accept it. The Chinese view that as like a tipping point, and I think Xi views that as a key part of his legacy. So we're going to face something in Taiwan between now and the end of this decade. It could be at any point before the end of this decade. I'm not saying it's tomorrow or next week, but I do believe that oftentimes on these things, particularly when it comes to dealing with a regime like the one in China, we make a big mistake thinking we would have a lot of advance notice about what would happen. They already have positioned enough forces in the region to move fairly quickly without little notice. And I think it's also a mistake to believe that we have the ability to fully understand their intent and their actions. It's not like these guys aren't communicating on text messages. I mean, they are pretty well protected and have pretty good operational awareness of how to protect how they deliberate. And the decisions are made by a small group of people. It's not the kind of decision that's being widely discussed, although you can pick up clues from some of the think tanks and others like that. But the last point I would make about all this is the one thing that I would tell you is kind of uncertain here is I do think China is facing some pretty substantial domestic challenges. Their economic growth is definitely going to continue to slow for the foreseeable future, both because of demographics and global conditions. They have a substantial amount of public debt on their books, for which we have no full transparency, but it's pretty clear they've been heavily invested in inefficient industries and real estate development, that at some point the bill for that comes due. And again, because of a lack of transparency, we don't fully appreciate or understand how severe and dramatic that is. I don't think the Chinese would do anything I don't think they will do anything. They're not going to start a war they think they run any risk of losing. If what happened to Russia happens to China and Taiwan, where they get bogged down, that's something they can't afford, and they're not going to let happen. And they're not going to do anything that undermines them internally and domestically, their grip on power, which some economic meltdown would. So to me, the only war they're interested in is one that's quick and decisive and over before there can be any foreign interference or any foreign action in regards to the United States. And I think once they reach that point, they're going to be tempted to do it if the Taiwanese won't go along with it. I think that happens before the end of this decade, one way or another, unless we can do something to extend that timeline. But I'm not going to say it's next week or next month, but I'm not going to say it's 5 years from now or 3 years from now. But certainly, I think before the end of this decade.
Well, I think I'm gonna omit my my last question because Senator, I know you've got votes you have to run to, but I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. You've been a great friend of the Institute, and I think everybody on the call should be reassured that we have people in Congress who can speak with and have such knowledge of global affairs as you do. And of course, I want to thank Walter for doing an outstanding job as only he can moderating the discussion. I hope, Senator, we'll see you at Hudson in the weeks ahead or early in the next Congress. And I hope we see all of you on this call at Hudson's Gala on December 11th in 2 weeks. So I hope, again, everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you for joining us, and special thanks to you, Senator, and also to Walter.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.